Sarah Mitchell adjusted her seatbelt as Flight 447 began its descent toward Denver International Airport. Outside her window, the Rocky Mountains stretched endlessly under a blanket of storm clouds that seemed to grow darker by the minute. She closed her eyes, trying to push away the familiar weight of memories that flying always brought back. 3 tours in Afghanistan had taught her to read danger in the smallest details, but tonight she was just another passenger heading home to visit her sister. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Boeing 737 shuddered slightly as it hit another pocket of turbulence. Sarah's trained instincts kicked in automatically, her body tensing in the way it always did when something felt wrong. But she forced herself to relax. She wasn't Staff Sergeant Mitchell anymore. She was just Sarah, a 29-year-old veteran trying to build a new life as a mechanical engineer in Seattle. That's when the lights went out. The emergency lighting flickered on immediately, casting an eerie red glow throughout the cabin. Sarah's military training snapped into focus like a rifle scope finding its target. While other passengers began to murmur nervously, she was already assessing the situation with the cold precision that had kept her alive in combat zones. Captain James Rodriguez felt the aircraft lurch violently to the left as every instrument on his control panel began flashing warning signals simultaneously. In his 15 years of commercial aviation, he'd never seen anything like it. The primary electrical system had failed completely, taking the autopilot, navigation computers, and most of the flight controls with it. "Mike, we've got a full electrical failure," Rodriguez called to his first officer, Michael Chun, whose hands were already moving across backup switches with practiced efficiency. "I'm switching to manual flight controls." But when Rodriguez pulled back on the yoke, nothing happened. The aircraft continued its uncontrolled descent, now at a terrifying angle that sent luggage tumbling from overhead compartments. The backup hydraulic systems, which should have maintained basic flight control even without electrical power, weren't responding either. 3 rows back, Sarah unbuckled her seatbelt despite the chaos around her. Her fellow passengers were beginning to panic, some screaming, others praying, but Sarah's mind was calculating. The angle of descent, the way the aircraft was shuddering, the specific sound the engines were making, it all pointed to something far worse than a simple electrical failure. During her second deployment in Kandahar, Sarah had witnessed a Chinook helicopter go down after taking enemy fire. The pilot, a seasoned warrant officer named Danny Walsh, had managed to save most of his crew by implementing emergency procedures that weren't in any manual. He'd worked with whatever systems still functioned, finding creative solutions when standard protocols failed. Sarah made her way toward the front of the aircraft, steadying herself against seats as the plane continued its erratic descent. Flight attendant Lisa Brennan was trying to calm passengers near the galley, her training keeping her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "Ma'am, you need to return to your seat," Lisa said as Sarah approached. "I'm former military," Sarah replied, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to crisis situations. "I need to speak with the flight crew." Lisa hesitated for a moment, but something in Sarah's demeanor, the way she moved with purpose while everyone else was paralyzed by fear, made her decision. She led Sarah to the cockpit door. Captain Rodriguez was fighting with controls that felt completely dead in his hands. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he tried every emergency procedure he could remember. The aircraft had lost another 1,000 feet of altitude in the past minute, and at their current rate of descent, they had maybe 8 minutes before impact. "Sir," Lisa's voice came through the intercom. "There's a passenger here who says she's former military and might be able to help." Rodriguez would normally never allow a civilian into the cockpit during an emergency, but these weren't normal circumstances. "Send her in." Sarah entered the cockpit, and immediately absorbed the chaos of warning lights and alarms. Her experience with military aircraft electronics kicked in as she scanned the instrument panel. What she saw confirmed her worst suspicions. "Captain, when did you last have control of the aircraft?" she asked, her voice cutting through the noise with military precision. "About 3 minutes ago, right after the electrical failure," Rodriguez replied. "Still pulling uselessly on the yoke. Nothing's responding." Sarah moved closer to examine the electrical panel. Her background in mechanical engineering, combined with her military experience with aircraft systems, allowed her to see what the pilots might have missed. The failure pattern wasn't random. It was cascading through the systems in a very specific way. "This isn't just an electrical failure," she said, her fingers tracing the circuit patterns on the emergency systems diagram posted near the captain's seat. "You've got a hydraulic contamination issue that's causing a feedback loop into your electrical systems." First Officer Chun looked up from his emergency checklist. "That's impossible. The hydraulic and electrical systems are completely separate." "Not entirely," Sarah replied, pointing to a section of the diagram. "There's a pressure sensor coupling that can create crossover contamination if the hydraulic fluid gets superheated. I've seen this on military transport aircraft." Captain Rodriguez was skeptical, but with conventional solutions failing, he was willing to listen. "Even if you're right, how does that help us? We still can't control the aircraft." Sarah was already studying the backup systems panel. "You've been trying to restore primary control, but that's not going to work. The contamination has to clear. First, we need to isolate the hydraulic system completely and switch to the emergency backup controls." "We tried that," Chun said. "The backup hydraulics aren't responding either." "Because you're still getting feedback from the contaminated primary system," Sarah explained. "There's an emergency isolation valve that completely separates the systems, but it has to be activated manually. It's not on your standard emergency checklist because it's almost never used." She pointed to a small panel near the floor of the cockpit. "That access panel there. Behind it is a manual isolation valve that will completely disconnect the primary hydraulic system from the backups." Rodriguez stared at her. "How do you know that?" "C-130 cargo planes have the same basic hydraulic architecture," Sarah replied. "I spent 2 years maintaining them in Afghanistan. When we had contamination issues from sand and extreme heat, sometimes manual isolation was the only solution." The aircraft lurched again, throwing everyone against the instrument panel. They were now at 8,000 feet and dropping fast. The Denver airport was still 15 miles away, but at their current trajectory, they wouldn't make it that far. "If you're wrong about this," Rodriguez said, reaching for the access panel, "we could make things worse." "Captain, with respect." "Things can't get much worse," Sarah replied. "Right now you have no control at all. This gives us a chance." Rodriguez made his decision. He opened the access panel and found the manual valve exactly where Sarah had said it would be. It was a heavy industrial valve that required significant force to turn. "Chun, help me with this," he called. Both pilots worked together to turn the valve. It moved reluctantly at first, then suddenly gave way with a loud clunk that resonated through the aircraft's frame. For a moment, nothing changed. The aircraft continued its uncontrolled descent, and Sarah felt a knot of doubt form in her stomach. Had she been wrong? Were they all about to die because she'd convinced the pilots to try an untested solution? Then, slowly, Rodriguez felt the slightest response in the flight controls. It wasn't much, maybe 10% of normal control authority, but it was something. "I've got partial control," he announced, his voice tight with concentration. "Very limited, but I can feel the rudder responding." Sarah moved to the engine controls. "Now we need to balance the thrust to help with directional control. The hydraulics are still compromised, so we'll need to use differential engine power to supplement whatever control authority you have." She began adjusting the throttles with small, precise movements. In Afghanistan, she'd seen pilots of damaged aircraft use engine power as a substitute for lost flight controls. It was a technique that required perfect coordination and split-second timing. "Reduce power on engine 2 by about 15%, she instructed. "That should help counteract the left roll tendency." Rodriguez followed her guidance, and slowly, incrementally, the aircraft began to respond. They were still descending much faster than normal, but now they had at least some control over their direction. "Denver approach. This is Flight 447 declaring an emergency," Chun radioed. "We have partial electrical and hydraulic failure with very limited flight controls. We're going to need emergency equipment standing by." The response was immediate. "Flight 447, Denver approach. We have you on radar. Emergency equipment is being positioned. What are your intentions?" Rodriguez looked at Sarah. They both knew that even with partial control, a normal landing was probably impossible. The aircraft was too damaged, the control authority too limited. "We need to find a long straight stretch where we can attempt an emergency landing," Sarah said. "Something without obstacles, preferably with emergency services nearby." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Chun was already checking his charts. "There's a closed runway at the old Stapleton Airport site. It's about 12 miles northeast of our current position. Completely clear, no obstacles. Can we make it that far?" Rodriguez asked, fighting to keep the aircraft level. Sarah looked at their altitude and rate of descent, making quick calculations. "It's going to be close. We need to stretch our glide as much as possible." She moved back to the engine controls. "We're going to use a technique called power-on gliding. Instead of reducing power to descend, we'll maintain just enough thrust to slow our descent rate while still maintaining forward speed." It was a delicate balance. Too much power and they'd waste fuel they couldn't spare. Too little and they'd fall short of their target. Sarah adjusted the throttles with the precision of a surgeon, constantly monitoring their altitude and distance. To the emergency landing site. Outside, the storm clouds had opened up and rain began pelting the aircraft. The weather was making their situation even more precarious, but Sarah noticed something else. The rain was actually helping to cool the overheated hydraulic system that had caused their original problem. "Captain, I think the hydraulic contamination is starting to clear," she reported, watching the system indicators carefully. "The cooling effect of the rain is helping, and with the system isolated, the contaminated fluid is beginning to settle." Rodriguez tested the controls again and found they were slightly more responsive than they had been minutes earlier. It still wasn't enough for a normal landing, but it gave them a better chance of survival. As they approached the abandoned Stapleton runway, Sarah could see emergency vehicles racing across the tarmac below. Fire trucks, ambulances, and rescue equipment were positioning themselves along the runway, ready for whatever was about to happen. "Ladies and gentlemen," Rodriguez's voice came over the intercom, steady despite the circumstances. "We're going to be making an emergency landing in about 3 minutes. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for impact." Sarah looked back through the cockpit door at the passengers she was trying to save. Families holding each other, business travelers clutching their phones, elderly couples praying together. Her military training had taught her that the mission always came first, but tonight the mission was bringing all these people home safely. The runway was getting closer, but they were still coming in too fast and too steep. Even with their limited control, this was going to be more of a controlled crash than a landing. "Sarah," Rodriguez said, using her first name for the first time, "I want you to know that without your help, we would have had no chance at all. Whatever happens in the next few minutes, you've already saved lives tonight." Sarah nodded, but her focus remained on the instruments. They weren't down yet, and as long as they were still flying, there was still work to do. Her military training had taught her that the mission wasn't over until everyone was safe on the ground. The runway lights were clearly visible now through the rain-streaked windscreen. In less than 2 minutes, they would find out if her split-second decisions and improvised solutions had been enough to save Flight 447. The abandoned runway at Stapleton stretched out beneath them like a concrete lifeline, but Sarah knew they were still coming in dangerously hot. The aircraft's damaged systems meant they had no flaps, no landing gear extension confirmation, and minimal braking capability once they touched down. "Gear down," Rodriguez called out, pulling the landing gear lever. "No green lights," Chun reported. "Immediately. We're not getting confirmation that the gear is locked in position." Sarah moved to the small cockpit window that allowed a partial view of the left main landing gear. Through the rain and darkness, she could barely make out the wheel assembly. "Left gear appears to be down, but I can't tell if it's locked," she said. This was another complication they couldn't afford. If the landing gear collapsed on touchdown, the aircraft would cartwheel down the runway at over 150 miles per hour. Even with emergency crews standing by, survival would be unlikely. "There's a manual gear extension procedure," Chun said, reaching for the emergency checklist. "But it requires someone to visually confirm the gear position from inside the cabin." Sarah was already moving. "I'll check from the passenger windows." She made her way back into the cabin, where flight attendant Lisa Brennan was helping passengers prepare for impact. The cabin was tense but surprisingly calm, considering the circumstances. Sarah had seen this before in combat situations. When people realized that panic wouldn't help their situation, they often found reserves of courage they didn't know they possessed. "Excuse me," Sarah said to a businessman sitting in a window. "Seat over the wing. I need to look outside for a moment." The man immediately unbuckled and moved aside. Sarah pressed her face to the window, using the emergency lighting to examine the right main landing gear. What she saw made her heart sink. The gear was partially extended, but one of the support struts was clearly bent. Even if it held during touchdown, it would almost certainly collapse under the stress of braking and directional control. She made her way to the opposite side of the aircraft to check the left gear. A young mother was sitting there with her 8-year-old daughter, both of them holding hands and whispering prayers. "Ma'am, I need to check something outside," Sarah said gently. The woman looked up with tear-filled eyes. "Are we going to be okay?" Sarah met her gaze steadily. In Afghanistan, she'd learned that sometimes the kindest thing you could do was be honest while still offering hope. "We're going to do everything possible to get everyone home safely. That's a promise." The left gear looked better than the right, but Sarah could see hydraulic fluid dripping from several connections. The system was failing progressively, and they were running out of time. She returned to the cockpit with the bad news. "Right gear is damaged. Left gear is losing hydraulic pressure. We're looking at a gear collapse scenario." Rodriguez absorbed this information without changing expression. His military background, he'd been a Navy pilot before commercial aviation, had taught him the same lesson Sarah had learned. You deal with the situation as it exists, not as you wish it were. "Options?" he asked. Sarah was thinking fast. "We can't prevent a gear collapse, but we might be able to control it. If we can keep the aircraft straight during the initial touchdown, then deliberately collapse the gear in a controlled manner, we might be able to slide the aircraft to a stop on its belly." "That's never been attempted on a commercial aircraft," Chun said. "But it's been done on military aircraft," Sarah replied. C-130s have belly-landed successfully when gear systems were damaged by enemy fire. The key is maintaining directional control and managing the deceleration rate. She pointed to the engine controls. "We use reverse thrust asymmetrically, more power on the left engine to counteract the right gear collapse. When both gears fail, We shut down both engines immediately to prevent fire risk and let the aircraft slide. Rodriguez was running through the physics in his mind. It was an incredibly risky maneuver, but given their situation, it might be their best chance. How much runway do we have? Chun checked his chart. The old Stapleton runway is 12,000 feet long. More than enough for a normal landing, but for a belly slide, ... We'll need every inch of it, Sarah finished. And perfect coordination between all of us. The runway was now less than a mile away. Emergency vehicles were positioned along its length, their lights creating a corridor of red and white strobes through the rain. Sarah could see that the fire department had already begun spraying foam on the runway surface to reduce friction and fire risk. Denver emergency. Flight 447, Rodriguez radioed. We're committed to landing on runway 16 with damaged landing gear. Expect a belly slide scenario. Request maximum foam coverage on the runway. Copy, Flight 447. Foam trucks are in position. Emergency medical and rescue teams are standing by. Sarah strapped herself into the jump seat behind the pilots. This was the moment when all their preparation would be tested. She thought about her sister waiting for her in Denver, probably watching the news coverage and wondering if her big sister would make it home. But mostly, she thought about the 89 passengers and crew members whose lives depended on the next few minutes going exactly right. 1 minute to touchdown, Rodriguez announced over the intercom. Everyone brace for impact. The runway threshold passed beneath them at 170 miles per hour, far faster than a normal landing, but the best they could manage with their limited control authority. Rodriguez was fighting to keep the wings level as crosswinds buffeted the aircraft. 50 feet, Chung called out. Watching the radar altimeter. Sarah could see the foam-covered runway rushing up to meet them. The emergency vehicles looked like toys from this altitude, but she knew they represented the difference between life and death for everyone on board. 20 feet. Rodriguez pulled back slightly on the yoke, trying to flare the aircraft for the gentlest possible touchdown. With no flaps and limited elevator control, it was like trying to land a brick with wings. 10 feet. The main landing. Gear touched the runway with a tremendous thud that shook the entire aircraft. For a brief moment, Sarah thought they might actually be able to land normally. The left gear held, and the damaged right gear seemed to be supporting the aircraft's weight. Then physics took over. The right landing gear strut, weakened by the damage Sarah had observed, buckled under the combined stress of the aircraft's weight and the side loads from the crosswind. The right wing dropped toward the runway as the gear collapsed completely. Right gear collapse. Chun shouted, but Rodriguez was already implementing Sarah's plan. He pushed the left engine to maximum reverse thrust while reducing power on the right engine. The asymmetric thrust helped keep the aircraft's nose pointed down the runway as it began to slide sideways on the collapsed gear. Sarah was thrown against her restraints as the aircraft lurched violently to the right, but she kept her eyes on the engine instruments. Left engine reverse thrust is good, right engine showing normal parameters. She called out. The left landing gear was still holding, but Sarah could see the hydraulic pressure dropping rapidly. They had maybe 10 more seconds before it would fail as well. Left gear is going, she warned. Rodriguez was ready. The moment he felt the left gear beginning to collapse, he shut down both engines completely and pulled the fuel cutoff levers. The aircraft settled onto its belly with a grinding roar that seemed to go on forever. Now they were truly sliding. The aircraft's aluminum belly scraping against the foam-covered concrete at nearly 100 miles per hour. Sparks flew past the cockpit windows, but the foam was doing its job, preventing the sparks from igniting any fuel vapors. Sarah watched the airspeed indicator wind down, 90 miles per hour, 80, 70. The aircraft was slowing, but not quickly enough. They were already past the halfway point of the runway, and at their current deceleration rate, they would run out of concrete before they stopped. "We're not going to stop in time," Chen said, voicing what they were all thinking. Sarah looked ahead through the windscreen. Beyond the end of the runway was an open field, but it was marked with construction equipment and debris piles from the airport's redevelopment project. If they slid into that area at high speed, the aircraft would break apart. "Emergency brakes," she said suddenly. "Do you have any brake pressure at all?" Rodriguez tested the brake pedals. "Very little, maybe 10%. Use them in short bursts," Sarah instructed. "Don't try to brake continuously or you'll blow the tires and lose what little control we have. Pulse them, 3 seconds on, 2 seconds off." It was a technique she'd learned from watching military pilots land damaged aircraft on short runways. By pulsing the brakes instead of applying constant pressure, they could maximize the available friction without overheating the brake system. Rodriguez began pulsing the brakes while Sarah monitored their speed and distance remaining. 60 miles per hour, 50, 40. The end of the runway was getting closer, but they were finally slowing at a rate that might be survivable. At 30 miles per hour, with less than 500 feet of runway remaining, Sarah made a decision that went against every instinct in her body. "Emergency evacuation," she called to the flight attendants over the intercom. "Prepare for immediate evacuation as soon as we stop." The aircraft was still moving at 20 miles per hour when it finally slid to a halt, just 200 feet from the end of the runway. The sudden silence was almost overwhelming after the chaos of the past few minutes. "Engine fire detection systems?" Sarah asked, checking the warning lights. "All clear," Chun reported. "No fire indications." Rodriguez was already shutting down all remaining systems to eliminate any ignition sources. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the captain. We've landed safely. Please remain seated while the flight attendants prepare for evacuation." But Sarah was already moving. Her military training had taught her that the mission wasn't complete until everyone was safely away from the aircraft. Fuel could still be leaking, electrical systems could spark, and the aircraft structure might be more damaged than they realized. She opened the cockpit door and immediately began helping the flight attendants with evacuation procedures. The passengers were remarkably calm, following instructions precisely and helping each other toward the emergency exits. Lisa Brennan was at the front left door, but when she tried to open it, nothing happened. "Door's jammed," she called out. Sarah moved to assist her. The door frame had been twisted during the belly landing, preventing the normal opening mechanism from working. But there was an emergency manual override that required significant force to operate. "Stand back," Sarah told Lisa, then threw her full weight against the emergency release handle. The door popped open with a loud bang, and the emergency slide automatically deployed. Sarah could see emergency vehicles racing toward them across the tarmac, their sirens adding to the organized chaos of the rescue operation. "Go, go, go!" Sarah shouted, helping passengers onto the slide as quickly as possible. The young mother and daughter she'd spoken with earlier were among the first to evacuate. As they reached the door, the little girl looked up at Sarah with wide eyes. "Thank you for keeping your promise," the child said simply. Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. But there was no time for emotions. There were still dozens of people to evacuate, and every second counted. Within 8 minutes, all 89 passengers and crew members had been evacuated from the aircraft. Sarah was the last person off, following the maritime tradition that the crew leaves last. As her feet touched the runway foam, she finally allowed herself to believe that they'd actually done it. Captain Rodriguez approached her as emergency medical teams began evaluating passengers for injuries. Remarkably, there were only minor cuts and bruises, the kind of injuries you'd expect from a hard landing, not a catastrophic aircraft accident. "Sarah," Rodriguez said, extending his hand, "I've been flying for 23 years, and I've never seen anything like what you did tonight. You saved every life on that aircraft." Sarah shook his hand, but her response was characteristically modest. "We all did, Captain. It was a team effort." As she spoke, a news crew was setting up nearby, preparing to cover the story of Flight 447's miraculous emergency landing. Sarah could already see the headlines forming. Military veteran saves commercial flight. Hero passenger prevents disaster. But Sarah wasn't thinking about headlines or recognition. She was thinking about her sister, who was probably racing to the airport right now, and about 88 other people who would get to go home to their families because of what had happened tonight. The storm was finally passing, and through the breaking clouds, Sarah could see the lights of Denver spreading out toward the horizon. Tomorrow she would continue her journey to visit her sister. Tonight, she had reminded herself why her military training had been about more than just following orders. It had been about taking responsibility for the lives of others, even when the stakes couldn't be higher. Flight 447 sat silent on the runway behind them, its belly scarred, but its passengers safe. In the end, that was all that mattered. 3 hours after Flight 447 came to rest on the Stapleton runway, Sarah found herself in an unfamiliar position, sitting across from a panel of investigators in a sterile conference room at Denver International Airport. The National Transportation Safety Board had arrived within an hour of the emergency landing, and they wanted to understand exactly how a catastrophic system failure had been overcome by what they were calling unconventional procedures. Lead investigator Robert Hayes, a veteran NTSB official with 30 years of experience, studied the preliminary reports spread across the table. "Ms. Mitchell, I need to be clear about something. What you did tonight has never been documented in commercial aviation. The manual hydraulic isolation procedure you recommended isn't part of any airline standard operating procedures." Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her chair. She'd been through military debriefings before, but this felt different. More formal, more consequential. "I understand that, sir. But the situation we faced wasn't standard either." Hayes leaned forward. "Walk me through your decision-making process. When you entered that cockpit and saw the instrument panel, what made you think the problem was hydraulic contamination rather than a simple electrical failure?" Sarah had been asking herself the same question. In those critical moments, she'd acted on instinct as much as knowledge, drawing connections between seemingly unrelated systems based on her experience with military aircraft. The failure pattern was wrong for a standard electrical problem. She explained, "When electrical systems fail on aircraft, they usually fail in predictable sequences based on circuit priorities. What I saw was more chaotic, systems failing and partially recovering in ways that suggested a feedback loop." Hayes made notes as she spoke. "And you'd seen this before?" "Not exactly," Sarah admitted. "But I'd seen similar issues on C-130, cargo planes in Afghanistan. Desert conditions, extreme temperatures, sand infiltration. They created problems that weren't covered in our technical manuals. We had to improvise solutions." Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the NTSB's human factors specialist, spoke up. "Sarah, can you help us understand your background? Your military record shows you were a maintenance specialist, but tonight you functioned more like a test pilot." Sarah thought about the question carefully. Her military service had been about more than just following procedures. It had been about understanding systems well enough to fix them when they broke in unexpected ways. In a combat zone, you don't have the luxury of calling technical support or waiting for replacement parts, she said. When an aircraft breaks, you figure out how to fix it with whatever resources you have available. That means understanding not just how systems are supposed to work, but how they actually behave under stress. Hayes pulled out a thick technical manual. According to Boeing's documentation, the manual hydraulic isolation valve you used tonight is considered an emergency measure of last resort. It's only supposed to be used when the aircraft is on the ground and all other options have been exhausted. "With respect, sir, all other options had been exhausted," Sarah replied. "We were 8 minutes from impact." At that point, the worst-case scenario of using the valve couldn't have been worse than the certain outcome of not using it. The room fell silent as the investigators absorbed this. Hayes had investigated hundreds of aviation accidents, but he'd rarely encountered a situation where unconventional thinking had prevented a disaster rather than caused one. "There's something else we need to discuss," Dr. Walsh said, consulting her notes. "Several passengers have reported that your presence in the cabin during the evacuation was instrumental in maintaining order. Can you tell us about that?" Sarah hadn't really thought about the evacuation in those terms. She'd simply done what needed to be done, the same way she'd approached every crisis in her military career. "People look for leadership in emergency situations," she said. "If they see someone who knows what they're doing and remains calm, they're more likely to follow instructions and help each other. It's basic crowd psychology." Hayes closed his notebook. "Ms. Mitchell, I want you to know that this investigation is preliminary, but based on our initial assessment, your actions tonight prevented what would have been a catastrophic loss of life. The aircraft you saved will never fly again. The structural damage from the belly landing is too extensive, but 89 people are alive because of the decisions you made." As Sarah left the conference room, she found Captain Rodriguez waiting in the hallway. He looked exhausted but relieved, the weight of command finally lifted from his shoulders. "How did it go?" he asked. "They're trying to figure out how to document something that's never been done before," Sarah replied. "Apparently we broke some rules tonight," Rodriguez smiled. "The best kind of rules to break." They walked together toward the airport's main terminal, where Sarah could see clusters of flight 447 passengers waiting for connecting flights or being reunited with family members. The young mother and daughter she'd helped evacuate were sitting near a coffee shop, the little girl coloring in a book while her mother spoke on the phone. "You know," Rodriguez said, "I've been thinking about what you said in the cockpit about this being a team effort. You're right, but there's something you need to understand. Teams need leaders, and tonight you were ours." Sarah was about to respond when she heard her name being called. Her sister Jessica was running across the terminal, tears streaming down her face. They embraced in the middle of the busy concourse, neither of them speaking for a long moment. "I saw the news coverage," Jessica finally said. "They're calling you a hero." Sarah pulled back and looked at her sister, the reason she'd been on Flight 447 in the first place. Jessica was getting married next month, and Sarah had promised to help with the wedding preparations. Such a simple reason to be on a plane, but it had put her in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. "I'm just glad to be here," Sarah said simply. As they walked toward baggage claim, Sarah's phone began buzzing with notifications. News outlets, interview requests, social media mentions. The modern machinery of fame was already grinding into motion. But Sarah wasn't thinking about any of that. She was thinking about the conversation she'd had with Captain Rodriguez about teams needing leaders. In the military, leadership had been about rank and chain of command. Tonight had been different. Tonight had been about recognizing a problem that needed solving and having the knowledge and confidence to act. "Sarah," Jessica said as they reached the baggage carousel, "I have to ask, were you scared?" Sarah considered the question. Had she been scared? In the moment, adrenaline and training had taken over, leaving little room for fear. But now, in the quiet aftermath, she was beginning to process what had actually happened. "I was focused," she said finally. "When you're trained to handle emergencies, fear becomes secondary to getting the job done. But yes, I was scared. Scared of letting people down." Jessica squeezed her sister's hand. "You didn't let anyone down. You saved them." Across the terminal, Sarah noticed Captain Rodriguez talking to a reporter, gesturing animatedly as he described the events of Flight 447. She could hear fragments of his conversation. Phrases like unprecedented situation and textbook example of crew resource management. But what struck Sarah most was something Rodriguez had said earlier: teams need leaders. In the military, she'd been trained to follow orders and execute procedures. Tonight, she'd learned something different, that sometimes leadership meant trusting your knowledge and experience, even when there was no manual to guide you. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Thank you for keeping your promise. Emma and Mom." It took Sarah a moment to realize it was from the young girl and her mother from the flight. That simple message meant more to her than all the interview requests and news coverage combined. It reminded her why she'd acted the way she had. Not for recognition or heroism, but because people were counting on her to do the right thing. As she and Jessica finally headed toward the parking garage, Sarah reflected on the strange twists that had brought her to this moment. A routine visit to help with wedding planning had become something much larger, a reminder that the skills she'd learned in the military weren't just about combat or following orders. They were about taking responsibility for others when the stakes couldn't be higher. Tomorrow, the investigations would continue. Engineers would study the wreckage of Flight 447 to understand exactly what had gone wrong and how similar failures could be prevented. But tonight, 89 people were going home to their families, and that was the only statistic that really mattered. Sarah Mitchell had boarded Flight 447 as just another passenger. She was leaving the airport as someone who understood that sometimes, when everything goes wrong, the most important thing you can do is refuse to give up on finding a solution. 6 months after Flight 447, Sarah stood in front of a packed auditorium at the University of Colorado's Aerospace Engineering Department. The invitation to speak had come from Dr. Marcus Thompson, the department head who'd been following the NTSB's final report on the incident. What had started as a simple guest lecture had evolved into something much more significant. The Boeing 737-800 that experienced the cascading system failure has been studied by engineers from around the world. Sarah told the audience of students, faculty, and industry professionals. What we learned changed how we think about aircraft system redundancy and crew resource management. In the front row, she recognized several faces from that night: Captain Rodriguez, who had become an advocate for expanding emergency training protocols, and Dr. Jennifer Walsh from the NTSB, who was now working with airlines to develop new crew training programs based on the Flight 447 incident. But the most unexpected face in the audience belonged to Marcus Chun, the first officer from Flight 447. He'd taken a leave of absence from commercial flying to pursue a master's degree in aeronautical engineering, inspired by what he'd witnessed that night. The traditional approach to aviation safety relies on extensive checklists and standardized procedures, Sarah continued. But Flight 447 demonstrated that sometimes you encounter situations that don't exist in any manual. The question becomes, how do you train people to think creatively under extreme pressure? After her presentation, Sarah was approached by Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a professor of cognitive psychology who'd been studying decision-making in crisis situations. "Sarah, I've been analyzing the timeline of your actions that night. You made 17 critical decisions in less than 12 minutes, and every single one was correct. That's statistically extraordinary." Sarah had heard similar analysis from other researchers. The incident had become a case study in multiple fields: aviation safety, crisis management, military to civilian skill transfer, and human performance under stress. But she remained uncomfortable with the academic attention. "I think you're overanalyzing it," Sarah replied. "Most of those decisions were based on information I already had from my military experience. The unusual part was having that specific background when it was needed." Dr. Rodriguez shook her head. "That's exactly what makes it remarkable. You recognized patterns from a completely different context and adapted them to a situation you'd never encountered before. That's not just knowledge, it's creative problem-solving under the worst possible conditions. As the evening reception continued, Sarah found herself in conversation with Marcus Chun. The young first officer had changed significantly since that night. The confidence he'd gained from successfully managing the emergency had translated into a deeper understanding of aviation systems. "I never thanked you properly," Chun said. "Not just for saving the flight, but for teaching me something about how to approach problems differently." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked. "In flight school, they teach you that there's always a procedure to follow, always a checklist that covers every situation," Chun explained. "But that night, I learned that sometimes the answer isn't in the book. Sometimes you have to understand the principles behind the procedures well enough to create new solutions." Their conversation was interrupted by a young woman Sarah didn't recognize. She appeared to be in her early 20s, with the focused intensity of someone who had something important to say. "Excuse me, Ms. Mitchell. My name is Amanda Foster. I'm a sophomore in aerospace engineering here, and I wanted to tell you something." Sarah waited as Amanda gathered her thoughts. "My father was on Flight 447, David Foster. He was the businessman sitting in 12A, who gave up his window seat so you could check the landing gear." Sarah remembered the moment clearly. The man had moved without question, understanding that something important was happening, even without knowing the details. "After that night, my dad told me about watching you work," Amanda continued. "How? You stayed calm and focused when everyone else was panicking. I'd already been interested in engineering, but seeing what you accomplished made me realize I wanted to specialize in aircraft systems." This was the kind of ripple effect Sarah hadn't anticipated. The immediate aftermath of Flight 447 had been about investigations and interviews, but the longer-term impact was still unfolding in unexpected ways. "That's wonderful, Amanda. Your father was very helpful that night, by the way. He understood the situation and responded exactly how we needed him to. He said you promised my mom and the little girl next to you that you'd get everyone home safely," Amanda said. "And you kept that promise. That meant everything to him." After the reception ended, Sarah walked across the campus with Dr. Thompson, who had been instrumental in organizing the evening's event. The university had offered her a position as a visiting lecturer, teaching a new course on crisis decision-making that would be cross-listed between the engineering and psychology departments. "Have you given any more thought to our offer?" Dr. Thompson asked. Sarah had been considering the position for weeks. After Flight 447, she'd received numerous job opportunities, consulting positions with airlines, speaking engagements, even a book deal. But the university opportunity was different. It would allow her to work with the next generation of engineers and pilots, helping them understand the intersection between technical knowledge and real-world problem-solving. "I'm interested," she said finally, "but I want to make sure I'm the right person for this. I don't have traditional academic credentials." Dr. Thompson smiled. "Sarah, what you have is something we can't teach in a classroom: the experience of applying engineering principles under life-or-death pressure. That's invaluable." As they reached the parking lot, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Jessica, who was now 6 months into her marriage and living in Portland. The message included a photo of a newspaper article with the headline, "Flight 447 hero to join university faculty. Saw the news. So proud of you. Can't wait to visit and meet your students. Jess." Sarah smiled at the message. Her relationship with Jessica had deepened since that night in Denver. The experience of nearly losing each other had reminded them both of what really mattered, and they'd made an effort to stay more connected despite the distance. But perhaps the most significant change in Sarah's life had been her growing understanding of how her military experience translated to civilian challenges. She'd entered the service thinking that military skills were primarily about combat and following orders. She was learning that the most valuable lessons had been about leadership, quick thinking, and taking responsibility for others, skills that applied far beyond any specific profession or situation. A week later, Sarah received a package with no return address. Inside was a child's drawing of an airplane with the words, "Thank you, Ms. Sarah," written in purple crayon. She recognized it immediately. It was from Emma, the 8-year-old from Flight 447. The drawing was simple but detailed, showing the airplane on the ground, surrounded by emergency vehicles and stick figures representing the passengers walking away safely. At the bottom, in what was clearly an adult's handwriting, was a note. "Emma wanted you to have this. She still talks about the brave lady who kept her promise. Thank you for giving us our daughter back." The Henderson family, Sarah hung the drawing in her new office at the university, where it would serve as a daily reminder of why she'd chosen to take the teaching position. Technical knowledge and engineering principles were important, but they only mattered if you could apply them when people were counting on you. Her first class would start in the fall, and she was already working on the curriculum. With Dr. Thompson and Dr. Rodriguez, they were designing something unprecedented, a course that would combine technical training with psychological preparation for crisis situations using Flight 447 as a foundational case study. But as Sarah looked at Emma's drawing, she realized that the most important lesson wasn't about hydraulic systems or emergency procedures. It was about recognizing moments when you have the knowledge and ability to help others, and choosing to act even when the outcome is uncertain. Flight 447 had lasted only 12 minutes from crisis to resolution, but it had changed the trajectory of multiple lives, not just the passengers who'd been saved, but the people inspired to pursue new careers, the researchers developing better training programs, and Sarah herself, who discovered a new purpose in sharing what she'd learned. 2 years after Flight 447, Sarah's life had settled into a rhythm she never could have imagined during her military service. Her office at the University of Colorado had become a hub of activity, with engineering students, psychology researchers, and aviation professionals regularly gathering to discuss crisis management and decision-making under pressure. The morning of March 15th started like any other, with Sarah reviewing lesson plans for her Advanced Crisis Systems Analysis course. Her students that semester included Amanda Foster, who had become one of her most dedicated pupils, along with several veterans using their GI Bill benefits to transition into aerospace engineering. Sarah's phone rang just as she was about to leave for class. The caller ID showed Captain James Rodriguez, though he was now Director of Safety Training for United Airlines, having been promoted after developing new emergency protocols based on their shared experience. "Sarah, I need your help with something." "Urgent," Rodriguez said without preamble. "We have a situation developing that's remarkably similar to Flight 447. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. "What kind of situation?" "There's a Lufthansa A320 over the Atlantic right now, experiencing cascading system failures. The crew is reporting hydraulic anomalies, partial electrical failures, and limited flight control authority. It's like Flight 447 all over again, except they're 800 miles from the nearest airport." Sarah was already reaching for her jacket. "What do you need from me?" "The FAA has established an emergency consultation center at Denver International. They want you there to help analyze the situation and provide recommendations to the crew through air traffic control." 20 minutes later, Sarah found herself in the same airport where Flight 447 had ended, but now in a secure operations center filled with screens showing real-time flight data, weather information, and communication logs. The atmosphere was tense but controlled, with representatives from the FAA, Lufthansa, Airbus, and several airlines working together to solve a problem unfolding at 35,000 feet. "Ms. Mitchell, thank you for coming," said Director Patricia Williams, the FAIZ regional administrator. Lufthansa Flight 441 departed Frankfurt 4 hours ago, bound for New York. They first reported hydraulic pressure anomalies about 90 minutes into the flight. Since then, they've experienced a progressive failure pattern that our engineers say matches the Flight 447 incident. Sarah studied the real-time data streaming from the troubled aircraft. The hydraulic system readings were indeed showing the same erratic pattern she'd observed 2 years earlier, pressure spikes followed by sudden drops, indicating contamination was creating feedback loops throughout the aircraft's control systems. Have they attempted the manual isolation procedure? Sarah asked. That's the problem, replied Dr. Kevin Nash, an Airbus systems engineer who'd flown in from Toulouse specifically for this consultation. The A320 has a different hydraulic architecture than the 737. The manual isolation valve exists, but it's in a different location and operates differently. Sarah moved to the technical diagrams spread across a large table. She'd spent considerable time since Flight 447 studying various aircraft systems, partly for her university courses and partly to better understand how the principles she'd applied might work on different aircraft types. The isolation principle should be the same, she said, tracing the hydraulic flow paths on the A320 schematic. But you're right, the execution would be different. Where's the manual valve on this aircraft? Dr. Nash pointed to a section of the diagram, here, in the main equipment bay. But it requires removing an access panel and manipulating a valve. That's designed for ground maintenance, not in-flight operation. Through the speakers they could hear the voice of Captain Eric Hoffman, Lufthansa Flight 441's commander, speaking with air traffic control. His English was precise, but carried the strain of someone dealing with an increasingly desperate situation. Frankfurt. Control. We are now experiencing total loss of primary flight controls. We have minimal control authority through backup systems only. Request immediate vectors to nearest suitable airport. Sarah looked at the flight tracking display. The aircraft was still 800 miles from Gander, Newfoundland, the closest airport capable of handling a wide-body aircraft emergency. At their current speed and rate of fuel consumption, it would be nearly 2 hours before they could attempt a landing. Can we establish direct communication with their crew? Sarah asked. Director Williams nodded. We can patch you through on the emergency frequency. Sarah put on a headset and was connected directly to Flight 441's cockpit. Captain Hoffman. This is Sarah Mitchell speaking from the FAA Emergency Operations Center in Denver. I'm the individual who was involved in the Flight 447 incident 2 years ago. There was a brief pause before Hoffman responded. Ms. Mitchell, I am familiar with your case. Our airline has studied your procedures extensively. Are you able to assist us? I believe so, Captain. First, I need to understand exactly what symptoms you're experiencing with your hydraulic systems. For the next several minutes, Sarah walked Captain Hoffman through a detailed analysis of his aircraft's condition. The symptoms were remarkably similar to Flight 447, but the A320's more sophisticated fly-by-wire systems were masking some of the problems while creating new complications. Captain, based on what you're describing, I believe you have the same hydraulic contamination issue we faced on Flight 447. However, your aircraft's computer systems are trying to compensate automatically, which may be making the problem worse. What do you recommend? Hoffman asked. Sarah looked at Dr. Nash, who was following the conversation carefully. We need to isolate the contaminated hydraulic system manually, just like we did on Flight 447. But on your aircraft, it's going to be more complex. She began explaining the location of the manual isolation valve, but quickly realized that accessing it would require someone to leave the cockpit and work in the equipment bay, while the aircraft was experiencing severe turbulence and control problems. Captain, Do you have any passengers with technical or aviation experience who might be able to assist? Sarah asked. We have several Lufthansa employees traveling as passengers, including 2 maintenance technicians, Hoffman replied. But the equipment bay access and turbulence ... I understand the risk, Sarah said. But without isolating that system, the contamination will continue to spread. You'll eventually lose all control authority. What followed was 45 minutes of the most intense technical consultation Sarah had ever experienced. Working with Dr. Nash and the Airbus engineering team, she developed a step-by-step procedure for accessing and operating the manual isolation valve on an A320 in flight. The Lufthansa maintenance technicians, guided by detailed instructions from the operations center, managed to reach the equipment bay and locate the valve. But when they attempted to operate it, they encountered a problem no one had anticipated. The valve is frozen, came the report from the aircraft. It appears to be seized by hydraulic fluid that has crystallized due to the temperature differential. Sarah felt the same sinking feeling she'd experienced on Flight 447 when conventional solutions weren't working. But her experience had taught her that there was usually another way to approach any problem. Can they apply heat to the valve mechanism? She asked Dr. Nash. Possibly, but what heat source would they have available? Sarah thought for a moment. Emergency flashlights. Most aircraft emergency flashlights generate significant heat. If they can position several flashlights around the valve for 10 or 15 minutes, it might warm the mechanism enough to free it. It was an improvised solution that no engineering manual would ever recommend, but it was based on the same principle that had guided her actions on Flight 447, understanding how systems actually behave under stress, rather than how they're designed to behave under normal conditions. The plan worked. After 20 minutes of heating, the valve began to move, and the Lufthansa crew was able to complete the isolation procedure. Almost immediately, Captain Hoffman reported improved control authority. Ms. Mitchell, we now have sufficient control to continue to Gander, he announced. Our estimated arrival is 45 minutes. Sarah remained in the operations center until Flight 441 landed safely in Newfoundland. All 187 passengers and crew members were unharmed, and the aircraft was able to make a conventional landing using backup systems. As the operations center began to wind down, Director Williams approached Sarah. What you did today saved another aircraft full of people. Have you ever considered working for the FAA full-time? Sarah smiled. Thank you, but I think I'm more valuable where I am, teaching the next generation of engineers to think the way we had to think today. Dr. Nash, who had been gathering his technical documents, overheard the conversation. Miss Mitchell, I have a question. Both Flight 447 and today's situation involved solutions that weren't in any manual. How do you train people to innovate under that kind of pressure? Sarah considered the question as she looked around the operations center, where dozens of professionals had just worked together to solve a problem in real time. You don't train people to innovate under pressure, she said finally. You train them to understand systems so thoroughly that innovation becomes possible when pressure demands it. As she drove back to the university, Sarah reflected on how much her life had changed since that night on Flight 447. She'd gone from being a passenger to being someone the aviation industry called when the impossible happened. But the most important change was her understanding that the skills she'd learned in the military, adaptability, systems thinking, and taking responsibility for others, were needed in ways she'd never imagined. Her students would be waiting for her tomorrow, eager to learn about crisis management and engineering problem solving. Today had given her a new case study to share with them, but more importantly, it had reinforced her belief that the best preparation for the unexpected was a deep understanding of how complex systems actually work, not just how they're supposed to work. 5 years after Flight 447, Sarah stood at the podium of the International Aviation Safety Conference in Montreal, looking out at an audience of over 2,000 aviation professionals from around the world. The invitation to deliver the keynote address was the culmination of a journey that had transformed her from an unknown veteran into one of the most respected voices in aviation safety. But today's speech would be different from the dozens of presentations she'd given about Flight 447 and emergency decision-making. Today, she was announcing something that would change how the aviation industry approached crisis training forever. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah began, "5 years ago, I was just a passenger on a commercial flight that experienced catastrophic system failures. What happened that night led to discoveries that have influenced how we think about aircraft design, crew training, and emergency response. But today, I want to talk about the future." In the front row, she could see familiar faces: Captain Rodriguez, now Vice President of Safety for the International Air Transport Association; Dr. Nash from Airbus, who had become a close collaborator on aircraft systems research; and Amanda Foster, who had graduated with honors and was now working as a systems engineer for Boeing. The aviation industry has always been reactive when it comes to safety improvements, Sarah continued. We wait for accidents to happen, then we study them and implement changes to prevent similar occurrences. But what if we could be proactive instead? What if we could train pilots and engineers to handle crises that haven't happened yet? The audience was listening intently. Sarah's reputation in aviation safety meant that when she spoke, people paid attention. Her recommendations had already led to changes in pilot training programs, aircraft design standards, and emergency response protocols. Over the past 3 years, working with teams from universities, aircraft manufacturers, and airlines around the world, we've developed something unprecedented: a comprehensive crisis simulation program that can replicate virtually any aircraft emergency scenario, including ones that have never occurred in real life. Sarah gestured to the large screens behind her, which displayed images of a sophisticated simulator facility. The Mitchell Crisis Training Center, opening next month at the University of Colorado, represents a completely new approach to aviation safety. Instead of training people to follow checklists, we're training them to understand aircraft systems so deeply that they can innovate solutions when the checklists don't apply. The facility was the result of 5 years of development, funded by a consortium of airlines, aircraft manufacturers, and government agencies who had recognized the value of Sarah's approach to crisis management. It would offer training programs for pilots, engineers, air traffic controllers, and emergency responders, using scenarios that pushed participants beyond their comfort zones. The center incorporates lessons learned not just from Flight 447, but from every aviation emergency of the past decade, Sarah explained. We can simulate cascading system failures, unprecedented weather conditions, and technical problems that don't exist in any manual. Most importantly, we can do this in a completely safe environment where failure is a learning opportunity, not a tragedy. After her presentation, Sarah was approached by Captain Ilana Vasquez, a senior pilot for American Airlines, who had been following Sarah's work for years. "Sarah, I have to ask, do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't been on Flight 447 that night?" It was a question Sarah had been asked many times, and one she'd thought about deeply. "I think someone else would have found a solution," she replied. "Maybe a different solution, maybe not as quickly, but humans are remarkably resourceful when survival is at stake. The real question is whether we can systematically develop that resourcefulness instead of hoping it will emerge naturally in a crisis." Captain Vasquez nodded thoughtfully. "That's exactly why your training center is so important. You're not just teaching procedures, you're teaching people how to think." Later that evening, at the conference reception, Sarah found herself in conversation with Dr. Michael Thompson, her former colleague from the University of Colorado, who had been instrumental in developing the academic framework for the Crisis Training Center. "Sarah, I've been meaning to ask you something," Dr. Thompson said. "You've accomplished more in 5 years than most people do in entire careers. What drives you to keep pushing forward?" Sarah looked around the reception hall, filled with aviation. Professionals discussing safety improvements, new technologies, and training methodologies. Many of the conversations were directly or indirectly influenced by the work that had grown out of Flight 447. "I think it started with a promise I made to a little girl on that flight," Sarah said. "I told her we'd get everyone home safely, and we did. But I realized that keeping that kind of promise shouldn't depend on luck or coincidence. It should be something we can count on because we've prepared for it." Dr. Thompson smiled. "You've certainly made that possible for a lot of people." As the evening wound down, Sarah stepped outside onto the hotel's terrace, overlooking the lights of Montreal. Her phone buzzed with a message from Jessica, who was now living in Vancouver with her husband and their 2-year-old daughter. "Saw your keynote on the live stream. Dad would have been so proud. Can't wait to bring Emma to see the training center next month. Love, Jess." Sarah smiled at the message. Their father had been a commercial pilot before his death 10 years earlier, and Jessica had named her daughter after the little girl from Flight 447, a connection that had brought the Henderson family and Jessica's family together as close friends. But as Sarah looked out at the city lights, she wasn't thinking about the past or even the training center that would open next month. She was thinking about a conversation she'd had earlier that day with Dr. Nash about the next generation of aircraft being developed by Airbus and Boeing. The new aircraft would incorporate artificial intelligence systems that could potentially handle many of the crisis situations that had previously required human innovation. It was exciting technology, but it also raised important questions about the role of human decision-making in aviation safety. "The challenge," Dr. Nash had explained, "is making sure that when the AI systems encounter situations they weren't programmed for, the human operators still have the knowledge and confidence to take control and find solutions." It was a challenge that would require everything Sarah had learned about crisis training, systems thinking, and human performance under pressure. The aviation industry was entering an era where the interaction between human intelligence and artificial intelligence would determine safety outcomes in ways that were still being understood. Sarah's phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but the area code was from Germany. "Ms. Mitchell, this is Captain Eric Hoffman, Lufthansa Airlines. I hope you remember me from Flight 441 3 years ago." Sarah certainly remembered Captain Hoffman. His successful emergency landing in Gander had become another case study in crisis management, and his crew's implementation of the manual isolation procedure had proven that the principles from Flight 447 could be adapted to different aircraft types. "Of course, Captain Hoffman. How can I help you?" "I'm calling because Lufthansa has been selected to participate in the first operational trial of the new Airbus A350XWB with advanced AI flight management systems. Based on our experience with Flight 441, the airline has asked me to recommend someone to help develop emergency protocols for human-AI interaction in crisis situations." Sarah found herself intrigued. The opportunity to work on the cutting edge of aviation technology, helping to define how humans and artificial intelligence would work together in emergency situations, was exactly the kind of challenge she'd been hoping for. "That sounds fascinating, Captain. What exactly would be involved?" "We'd need someone to help design training scenarios where AI systems encounter situations beyond their programming, and human operators need to take control. Someone who understands both the technical aspects of aircraft systems and the psychology of decision-making under extreme pressure." It was a perfect description of everything Sarah had been working toward since Flight 447. The opportunity to help shape the future of aviation safety, ensuring that technological advances enhanced rather than replaced human capability, was irresistible. I'd be very interested in discussing this further, Sarah said as she ended the call. Sarah realized that her journey from Flight 447 passenger to aviation safety expert was entering a new phase. The skills she'd learned in the military, refined through crisis situations, and developed through academic research were now needed to help solve challenges that didn't yet exist. She thought about the promise she'd made to Emma Henderson on Flight 447, not just to get everyone home safely that night, but implicitly to help ensure that future passengers would have the same protection. The training center was one step toward fulfilling that promise, and now the opportunity to work on human-AI interaction in aviation represented another as Sarah headed back inside. She passed a group of young aviation professionals discussing the presentations they'd heard that day. One of them, a recent graduate who couldn't have been older than 25, was explaining to his colleagues how the principles from Flight 447 had influenced his approach to systems engineering. The key insight, he was saying, is that you can't just design systems to work perfectly under normal conditions. You have to design them to fail gracefully and to give humans the information and authority they need to improvise solutions when everything goes wrong. Sarah smiled as she listened. That young engineer had grasped something that had taken the aviation industry decades to understand, that safety wasn't just about preventing failures, but about empowering people to respond effectively when failures inevitably occurred. Next morning, as Sarah prepared to fly back to Denver, she reflected on how different this airport experience was from that night 5 years ago. Then, she'd been just another passenger, hoping to get home safely to visit her sister. Now she was someone the aviation industry looked to for guidance on its most complex challenges. But in some ways, nothing had changed. She was still someone who understood aircraft systems, still someone who remained calm under pressure, and still someone who took responsibility for the safety of others. The difference was that now she had the platform and resources to make that responsibility extend far beyond any single flight. As her plane took off from Montreal, climbing into the clear morning sky, Sarah looked down at the city where she'd just announced the next phase of her work. Somewhere below, aviation professionals were returning to jobs where they might one day face the kind of crisis that had defined her own life. Thanks to the training center, the research programs, and the continuing evolution of aviation safety practices, those professionals would be better prepared than any generation before them. They would have the knowledge, the training, and the confidence to keep the promises that every person in aviation makes implicitly, to bring everyone home safely, no matter what goes wrong. Flight 447 had lasted only 12 minutes from crisis to resolution, but its impact would continue for decades to come. In every properly trained pilot, every well-designed aircraft system, and every passenger who arrived safely at their destination because someone, somewhere had learned to think differently about what was possible in a crisis. As her flight reached cruising altitude, Sarah opened her laptop and began working on the curriculum for the first Human-AI Crisis Management course. There was still work to do, more promises to keep, and new challenges to overcome. But she had learned something important from Flight 447, that the most significant transformations often begin with a single person choosing to act when others might hesitate. The aviation industry was safer because of what had happened that night, and it would continue to evolve because people like Sarah, Captain Rodriguez, Dr. Nash, and thousands of others had chosen to learn from crisis rather than simply survive it. In the end, that was the real legacy of Flight 447, not just the lives saved that night, but the countless lives that would be protected in the future by the lessons learned when everything went wrong. And a former sergeant chose to keep her promise. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, You won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.